We use the word iconic a lot, almost to the point where it's lost all meaning. We may call something like the riff from Smoke on the Water iconic, or maybe the multitude of quotable lines of dialogue from movies like Star Wars, or Wayne's World, or The Lion King. But in the same breath, we also apply the same label to sharply dressed South Korean teenagers and yellow bricks with wings. In my opinion, to be iconic is to be something that shaped a generation. And yeah, okay, K-pop could fit that description, I suppose, if it absolutely has to. But I think we can all agree on one thing. Need for Speed is iconic. Need for Speed as a series is absolutely iconic. It's prolific, it's a household name. It is arguably the most important series of racing video games out there. Its legacy sending a ripple through the game industry and changing the genre as we knew it. From its street racing glory days to its uncomfortable teenage period of trying new things on before reverting back to its old self, to its admirable attempt to keep street racing culture alive to this very day. The series has a presence that almost no other racing series could ever hope to achieve. Surprisingly, no one seems to have tackled the series at length, at least from what I've seen in my extensive 3-second glance at YouTube. So my aim, over the next few weeks or months depending on my work ethic, which we all know is terrible, is to do an almost complete retrospective on the series. What I hope to do is to cover every single Need for Speed game from Underground onwards, including ports and not including mobile ports or any game that came before Underground because, to be honest, I don't have anything particularly interesting to say about them. I mostly want to discuss the period when Need for Speed switched over from highway racing to street racing, and the effect it had on the series as a whole. And today, we start off with the game that started a racing revolution. In 2001, Paul Walker and Vin Diesel were doing their usual thing, racing through the streets of Los Angeles in their souped-up Japanese imports as they always did. It just so happened that some bystanders filmed it with their expensive film-grade cameras, and thus a media powerhouse was born. The Fast and the Furious and its sequel, Too Fast, Too Furious, were commercial successes, bringing in well over $400 million between them at the box office. Not to mention the absurd grip the franchise has on audiences today with, 9 movies and $5 billion earned between them all. I mean, Jason Statham's in some of them now, so I don't blame people for wanting to go see those movies, but I digress. The impact these movies had at the time were immense. Street racing definitely existed before The Fast and the Furious, but after its release, suddenly everyone was rushing out to slap dodgy looking flames and a spoiler made out of cardboard and Tarzan glue in their Mitsubishi Magna. And of course, that influence was felt by the video game industry as well. There were street racing games available before Need for Speed's valiant attempt at replicating the culture. Hell, Midnight Club predates The Fast and the Furious by about 8 months. But in 2003, EA swooped in to steal the spotlight. And boy did they ever. Released on the PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube, Game Boy Advance, and PC in 2003, Need for Speed Underground was a stark contrast to what had been done before. EA Black Box's previous effort, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, was a great success in terms of fan response and the fact that it sold 4 million copies. So EA brought Black Box on again for another project, one that would launch the racing series into the modern era. Gone were the highway pursuits and lengthy circuits situated in various exotic locales around the world, replaced with glistening city roads and tight 90-degree turns. Lamborghinis and Ferraris were replaced with something you might actually be driving in real life. It was a very familiar, yet very different experience. For reference, this is the GameCube version being emulated on a PC, so it may look a little different to the actual thing, because... shut up, I don't have a frame master. The game starts almost immediately, who'da thunk it, with a race. You're plumped into a tricked-out Honda Integra and given 2 laps around a circuit in the titular Olympic City to get a taste for what's to eventually come. Once the race ends, it's all revealed to be a sequence taking place inside the player's playfully imaginative mind. This would later go on to become a staple of the series, a brief introductory race or set of races in which you get to drive a desirable car, giving players a taste of what's to come before being booted out and back into a low-end machine. It's the same deal here. After that race, a woman named Samantha lets you pick from 5 less than desirable cars to start off with. The MX-5 isn't that cool, guys, it's a stupid little gremlin car, don't give me no sass. Though, no matter what you pick, she always gives the same response.
Ouch, that is seriously weak, dude.
Good evening, welcome to the Blind Pig. I'll be your waiter tonight. Your choices are this plate of poop or this bowl of piss. The former with bonus corn pieces, and the latter lightly seasoned with flakes of smegma. Ouch, that is seriously weak, dude.
What the fuck? The game does set up an underlying narrative, but it's so comparatively unimportant when up against the gameplay and takes up so little of your time, less than 10 minutes of cutscenes total, that you can safely skip every single cutscene and still get the same experience. All you get by not skipping the cutscenes are overbearingly bloomy clips, backed up by exactly the kind of acting you would expect from a G-rated game about illegal street racing.
I trusted you, and now you want to take me on? See you at the street, punk.
Thank you, Cindy Johnson, very cool. Once you've slapped some moolah on your first car, in my case the somewhat overlooked Peugeot 206, you're let loose into Olympic City to claim the underground for your own. Well, I say let loose, but you actually don't get to explore the city at your own pace. Despite the entire city being fully modelled, the career mode is a linear selection of circuits, sprints, and the like. This was an era before every second racing game was backed up by a fully explorable open world, which I think is fine. Choosing to focus solely on the racing makes for a more streamlined experience in my opinion. But all the routes take place on a fully modelled map, so the fact that you can't explore it feels like offering a plate of corned beef and veggies with no white sauce. Give me my fucking white sauce, cunt. Anyway, off we go in our little 206. The first thing I noticed is that despite the fact that we're starting in a 130 horsepower Peugeot, a far cry from the starting Lotuses and Fords of Hot Pursuit 2, there's a surprisingly thrilling sense of speed. It doesn't sound like the most engaging time, cruising about the place in a French hatchback that can barely top 180 kilometers an hour, but the dev team did everything they could to make even the slowest stock cars feel exhilarating to drive. Oddly, I found that getting to grips with the handling takes a little getting used to. Cars feel oversensitive in the way that simply tapping the stick sends your little ricer veering off in the direction you tapped, but taking certain corners sometimes requires a very precise racing line and even slowing down a considerable amount. Yeah, I mean, okay, I get it, you have to brake at some point, but with how oversensitive the handling is, it kind of feels like you would never really need to brake, if that makes sense. The oversensitive steering can make setting up for entry into narrow shortcuts a bit of a pain at first, and later circuits and sprints have sections that are so windy and narrow that a very precise racing line is required, but the physics on offer here can be pretty rewarding when you glide around a corner at over 200 k's an hour and blast past the competition. You also have access to a tank of nitrous that will give you a big speed boost when used, but your nitrous is limited and there's no way to get it back without finishing or restarting the race, so it's important to choose when to use it strategically. The lowest level of nitrous feels like a wet fart and kind of almost sounds like one too, but the higher levels of nitrous are oh so satisfying. It falters a little in the track design. The tracks themselves are decently designed, lots of windy paths coupled with many opportunities to hit the nitrous button and boost your way to 320 k's an hour. But because all the routes take place in the same city, not only does the scenery get a little repetitive, but because of how small the map is, so do the sections of the city used. You're gonna have to get used to seeing areas like this succession of jumps pretty regularly, and it can make the career mode a little bit of a slog, especially in the early stages when you're stuck racing the same two circuits several times in succession. The career mode, as mentioned before, is unashamedly linear. You're presented with a selection of 1 to 6 events, and when you clear all of them, you get a new selection. This continues right through to the end of the game, with no real opportunity to break out of the linear progression. There is a decent variety on offer here, with each event being one of 5 distinct types. Circuit and sprint are self-explanatory, just get across the finish line first. And for circuit events, there's also a lap knockout variant where the driver in last place at the end of each lap is eliminated from the race. One of the other types is drag racing, a short 30 to 40 second gun down the main street and weave through traffic like it's a scene from Baby Driver event, where steering left and right snaps your car to the lane next to you and you need to shift gears at the right time to maximize your acceleration to get out ahead. Drag events can be some real edgy your seat, pucker your anus exciting shit, but traffic feels scripted and some obstacles sometimes feel impossible to avoid. Like this damn train. If you jump over it, you skim the top and die. If you try to drive past it, it T-bones you and you die. If you see it on the side of the road and pull over to help it out, it points a gun at you, tells you to get out of the car, speeds off, leaving you stranded with no civilization for miles and you die. There's a lot of unfair situations that crop up all the time in drag events, and as a result they very quickly go from a grand old time to an exercise in patience as you retry for the 7th time. Otherwise, there's also drift mode, which, under the right circumstances, can be a hell of a lot of fun. Get your car sideways and rack up some points. The faster you're going, the more angular your angle is, and the closer you get to the barricade, the more points you get. I say it's fun under the right conditions because if you use a car such as the rotary legend that is the Mazda RX-7, pulling off and maintaining combos is some slick, satisfying shit. But take a car such as the Ford Focus onto the track and suddenly you've got more grip than... Anyway, the drift mode doesn't feel half-baked, unlike games that attempt to shoehorn in drift modes these days, such as Gran Turismo. It's fast, fluid, and honestly pretty addicting. No, you will not be getting an initial D joke out of me. I may like old memes, but I have some dignity. Each event unlocks you new parts for your car, of both the performance and visual varieties. Underground's customization system is nowhere near as in-depth as some of the later offerings in the series, but even now, it overshadows so many current-gen games. Titles like Forza occasionally allow you to change body kits and spoilers and rims and slap some decals on. Underground goes way deeper than that. Front and rear bumpers, side skirts, spoilers, neons, exhausts, window tint, roof scoops for some fucking reason. There's a lot of opportunities to make your car look unique, and also make your Nissan Sentra look like total arse. I mean, the Nissan Sentra already is the equivalent to a motorized L, and anyone who chooses to drive it is a brainlet, but that's beside the point. I mean, yeah, okay, the vinyl editor is extremely basic, only allowing certain preset vinyls and not allowing you to reposition them in any way. But back in 2003, this was the coolest shit. Coming off of games like Gran Turismo, where you couldn't even repaint cars you'd won or purchased, this was absolutely insane. Look at this thing, it's beautiful. Beautiful, I say. Park this bitch in the Louvre. The one thing about it is that parts can be slapped on willy-nilly because money is never really an issue. I played the career mode through mostly on medium, occasionally dropping down to easy because I didn't have the time to get stuck on a race for too long. And even so, I had an unbelievable excess of income to splurge on whatever I wanted. Thing is, don't know if this is entirely true, but I feel like I could buy literally every part and still have enough change to bail myself out of prison for tax fraud. I have a feeling that it's because of how the game funnels you through the extremely linear career mode. Because there's no opportunity to go back and replay races you've already won to make a bit of extra bank, there'd be the potential to softlock players into a race where they're suddenly not competitive and can't progress because they'll never be able to afford the parts they need. This negates any reason to play on higher difficulties unless you're looking for a bracket unfair end bracket challenge. Further negating this is the fact that some events have so little monetary gain between difficulties that there's no reason to play on anything higher than easy. Why play the event on medium difficulty if the only thing you're going to get out of it is enough money for 2/3 of a KFC family bucket? There's also the fact that for a game that touts such an expressive feature as vehicle customization, it's a shame the parts are unlocked at such a slow pace. There's a very limited selection of bumpers, side skirts and spoilers in particular for about 70 to 80% of the game, stuck with the same 6 kinda boring looking bumpers, many of which just don't work with some cars, at least in my opinion. Also, you only get one slot for a car, so you don't actually own like a whole garage of cars or anything, you just sort of trade cars in and out. So if you've got a Hyundai Coupe and you want to get a Nissan 240SX or something like that, you have to trade in the Hyundai and replace it with the 240SX. And when you swap the cars out, you'll either get a trade-in or a rebate, so that just sort of makes money even more redundant. Despite the repetitiveness and redundancy of earning money, Underground has a pretty fun career mode nonetheless. The first 2/3 of the game in particular are usually quite challenging but fair. However, it's the final third where the cracks start to show a little. Zipping around Olympic City in a fully upgraded 350Z is a heck of a time, but the game eventually decides that it doesn't want to play fair anymore. Old racing games were notorious for their use of something known as rubber banding, or catch-up. Essentially, to make races more interesting, opponents would speed up to close the gap if they fell too far behind, or slow down if you fell too far behind, almost as if you were tied to each other with invisible rubber bands, hence the obvious name. Pick a racing game and it probably has some implementation of catch-up. The rubber banding in Underground is so shameless that you can physically see it in effect at times. Look at this, man, look at this bullshit. This happens on every difficulty. In fact, because of it, there were some times where I switched down to easy difficulty only to find myself having just as much trouble as medium, if not more. Not only do you have to contend with opponents who spontaneously hit the speed of light, but there's one major roadblock to your success, arguably even more of a threat than your opponents. Yep, the traffic. Like a heat-seeking missile deployed by the man himself, some random Soccer Mom minivan will find you and hit you head on. And at that point, you can just kiss your victory goodbye. It's an inevitable part of life, like getting a job, or being depressed because you're an anxious fuck who has no money so your life spirals out of control. Just like every time you collide with traffic in Underground. Look at this, it's me! Literally me, RN! On top of all that, the game likes to throw you off by presenting tantalizing little shortcuts for you to take if you're in desperate need of closing the gap between you and the hideous Dodge Neon out in front. But while some shortcuts are beneficial, others are detrimental in every sense of the word. This shortcut that cuts through a park near the airport terminal, for example, sends you flying into an invisible wall no matter whether you're doing the circuit in reverse or not. There's no point to ever taking this, at least not for you, but your opponent's Lancer magically positions into the best direction out of the shortcut, like he has some fucking super advanced yaw control system, like I fucking think yaw be cheating! The whole last third of the game is... I don't want to say unbearable, like, no, the game can still be enjoyable when everything clicks, but not everything clicks all the time. Shortcuts become too much of a risk for so little reward, new parts take a little too long to unlock, and the AI becomes infuriatingly unfair at times, especially on those 6-lap races where they're suddenly tickling your ass hairs for the entire last lap before leaving you in the dust around the final corner despite you driving so perfectly. The guys who set the gold medal times on the Gran Turismo 4 license tests would be jealous. I'm coining this term now. Need for Speed Underground suffers from what I want to call Jack 2 syndrome. Veterans of the channel will know how much I dislike the final third of Jack 2 because of the arbitrary and inequitable jump in difficulty. And while Underground's final third is nowhere near as hard in my opinion, there's almost as much unfair bullshit that may cause some players to drop the game entirely. At least Underground doesn't have an escort mission. And it doesn't help matters that the end of the game isn't particularly worth reaching. The game builds up this guy named Eddie to be the most notorious and skilled racer in the scene, and at several points throughout the career mode your progress up the ranks is undermined as you hear of his prowess and how unstoppable he is in his shit shade of a skyline.
Did you hear? Eddie's hung up his driving gloves. He says there's no one out there who's worth racing against. Until someone proves themselves, he's just gonna relax.
But when you finally get to challenge him, he's a complete pushover, and the race against him barely lasts a minute and a half. The real final boss is a mysterious new challenger in a silver 350Z. Spoilers, it's Eddie's fucking girlfriend. And once you beat her in a race that takes almost 6 times as long as Eddie's, the game just kind of, well, ends. In fact, if it weren't for the opportunity to unlock a bunch of new parts and cars, the career mode would be kind of a letdown. It has a couple ideas that don't quite meet their potential. For example, there's a ranking for each of the 4 main event types that you move up by winning races in each of them. What sounds like a potentially dynamic ranking system in which you go up or down depending on your performance on the street is actually just a visual cue of how far through the game you are, which is pointless because this already exists on the event select screen. You only move up in rank at predetermined points in your career and can never fall back down. The way the career mode bottlenecks you through it means there's no opportunity for more dynamic mechanics, so this whole system is nothing more than a virtual pat on the back. Otherwise, the career mode is pretty bog standard, nothing at all revolutionary here. God knows how I spat out 4,000 words about this game, to be honest. In fact, God knows how I've gone this long without acknowledging the soundtrack. Oh yeah, there it is. I'm willing to wager my lungs that Need for Speed Underground is remembered more so for this song than the actual gameplay. It fits right into what I was initially talking about, how iconic this series is. This song fits that bill perfectly, immediately setting the tone of the game. Is it good? Fuck no. It's horrible, trash, drivel for the lowest common denominator. And yet you just can't get much more iconic than that. The whole soundtrack is pretty good as well, to be honest. You've got stuff from Rob Zombie, The Crystal Method, Petey Pablo, Asian Dub Foundation, Oh geez. As much as I genuinely love Lost Prophets, it's hard not to be reminded of how frontman Ian Watkins is in prison for 29 years for 13 sexual offences against children. Large yikes.
When our time is up.
Oh yeah, your time's up, pal. This is less of a criticism and more of an observation from someone who has, for some reason, actually taken notice of this, but the way censorship has always worked in Need for Speed soundtracks is whack, y'all. Consider that the title song of a G-rated game is about some dude telling a voluptuous female to get down low and shake her ass. This is a clean version of the song, mind, but then lines such as still pop up, and it's like, what? Think of the children, you monsters! The censorship continues to several other songs as well, with some minor stuff like the Lost Prophets song To Hell We Ride simply being shortened to Ride, fair enough. But then you jump over to the hip-hop part of the soundtrack and suddenly there's chunks of vocal tracks missing in almost every single verse. Why include 24s by T.I. when A, it's a horrible song, the chorus sounds like 3 dudes trying to cumbersomely rap over each other in a bid to get the most attention, and B, there's several second gaps like this. There are plenty of songs from the genre that could be used that aren't nearly as explicit, but instead we get these lazy edits that sound awful in my opinion. There's so many holes in the lyrics that it could potentially trigger someone's trypophobia. Again, I'm probably the only one that cares, but this is a common theme throughout the series. Nonetheless, good soundtrack. Bit short, but suits the action nicely. I don't think there's much else to talk about here. Apart from the career mode, there's the usual free play and split screen modes, and for the PS2 and Xbox versions there was online racing, though you'll need a time machine if you want to experience that for some reason. And that's pretty much it. Admittedly, Need for Speed Underground doesn't have a lot going for it compared to racing games that preceded it. It's got a bog standard career mode that funnels you through with no opportunity for any sort of player choice. The tracks are fun but repetitive, and the latter third of the career mode may test your patience. Is it worth playing nowadays? Honestly, unless you're really into the genre and want to experience the birth of modern day Need for Speed, then that's kind of debatable. There are games that do what Underground does much better. And yet, I still have a soft spot for the original Underground. From the hype as fuck techno, hip hop and rock soundtrack to the bright and blaring visual style to the relatively in-depth vehicle modifying, it's not a game that's necessarily worth playing in this day and age, but if you do end up getting your mitts on a copy, you'll probably enjoy it. I mean, this is maybe my 5th run through it and I still get a kick out of it. Plus, of course, it's at least worth remembering from a historical standpoint, considering it laid the foundation for what would later become one of the most fondly remembered games of all time, Need for Speed Underground 2. With each Need for Speed video I do, I'd also like to tackle any ports where at all possible, seeing as Need for Speed is rather infamous for releasing a version of each game on almost every device under the sun. Underground was released before the heavy-hitting Nintendo DS and PlayStation Portable hit the market, so thankfully my job's easy this time around because we only have the Game Boy Advance version to talk about. Admirably, this version tries its best to emulate the console version, and even tries a couple things to differentiate itself from its big bro. For example, that ranking system from the console versions that doesn't do diddly squat, it's actually a main method of progression here. You select one of the races in the rankings and attempt to knock them out of their spot and claim it for your own, making for a bit more of an involved and open-ended design. Not that that's enough to make this game worth playing. I mean, sure, 8-year-old me might have actually beat this game if they owned it, but nowadays it's a relic of the past that has no reason to be brought back. Technically speaking, Underground on the GBA is pretty impressive, managing 3D graphics rather than going for the top-down view or sprite-based Mario Kart Super Circuit-esque style most GBA games were going with, but the GBA just can't seem to handle it. Environments just kinda blend together, making some corners especially hard to read, and the low FPS combined with the obnoxious screen shaking in certain circumstances is literally nauseating. I can withstand an hour in Beat Saber and feel totally fine. Meanwhile, this GBA game was the one to make me almost throw up. Plus, there's no nuance to the driving at all. You're either fully committing to a turn or you're not. Pressing left or right sends you veering into corners with reckless abandon and also slows you down considerably. And the tracks, from the very few that I played, seem to have little variation, which is undesirable because these races are surprisingly long. Everything here is technically quite proficient, and it plays okay enough. Plus there is incentive to play through so you can unlock new cars and parts to customize said cars with, but it's just not particularly enjoyable. It becomes even less playable when your ears pick up on the licensed soundtrack that they somehow managed to squeeze into the cartridge along with everything else. It's one thing trudging through races to the tune of a very bit-crushed rendition of The Only by Static X, but the menu is accompanied by a very low quality version of Get Low, more like Get Low Quality. And almost every time you enter a new menu, it restarts. This was designed by an actual asshole. Thanks for tuning in to the first part of the Need for Speed retrospective. Next up is of course Need for Speed Underground 2, and while my schedule will be a little erratic with e-raws and other reviews playing alongside it, I'll try and have it out as soon as possible. If you enjoyed this, maybe slap that like button. Tell me what you thought in the comments below. As ever, a big thank you to my patrons, including Mitchell Reese, Diablo5564, Nation McAltile, Dakota Lewis, Jenna, my tits are bigger than veils but barely, Julian Brown, Nathaniel Forrest, Vidi Vitanen, Bite My ASCII, Orvanil, Isaac Lamp, Wastrel USA, Damian Maxted, Oliversla, Tyler Cross, Duncan Austin, Pastor Boy, Gabba Scabba, Leo Alex 50, Heat Hoot Skyet, Global Truncation Era, Laurent Lacroix, Sheepy, Loomis Doomis, Chatter Estop, Gapnicon, Cooper James Price, Sebastian Orbe, Travis Miranda, Thomas Hart, Lazaro Dave, The Ruby Red Rose, Philip Iaki, and a very, very big special thank you to Chris Passamonte. It's Passamonte, Ren, you fucking idiot. It's actually really hot. I think I'm getting heat stroke under this blanket, so
I'm out. Like, comment, rate 5 stars, subscribe, reblog, whatever.